sales, but the new Super Constellations were to be the test bed for a revolution in military aviation. Today, the concept of aerial command posts, electronic surveillance centres and radar stations is commonplace. They've proved their worth time and again during their short career. Most of the experimentation that proved their effectiveness was conducted in constellations, as was most of their early service. Again, old 1961 was involved in making aviation history, as with domes above and below, the original plane was used to trial the installations. The first Connies constructed as airborne radar pickets were built for the Navy. They replaced earlier rudimentary installations aboard converted World War II bombers. Aboard the planes, a crew of 22 were involved, with aircrew, radar operators and engineers. With their long range coupled to the search range of their extensive load of equipment, these Navy WV-1s proved the worth of the concept and installed it as an accepted part of naval practice. Soon, the idea spread to the Air Force. The Air Force had placed orders for Super Connies for use as conventional transports, but C-121s would not be delivered as such until 1956. Before any transports could be built, the Air Force acknowledged their better use as airborne early warning aircraft and changed the order for the first 10 to its own flying radar pickets as RC-121Cs. These planes, loaded with 15,000 pounds of radar equipment, would cruise at 335 miles per hour for up to 24 hours on patrol. The RC-121C was similar to early Navy Super Connies, with their height-finding radar housed in the 8-foot-tall hump, and the bearing scanner located in the ventral dome. The RC-121Cs entered service in 1953 and were mostly employed in patrolling the western seaboard of the USA. They were followed in 1954 by the first of an order for 72 RC-121D Warning Star aircraft. In addition to the passive role of detection, these incorporated offensive activity as control centres for the guidance of fighter interceptors. From the basis of the Warning Star, a number of options presented themselves. Once the idea of putting equipment into aircraft was digested, there was a rush of ideas about which equipment might be suited to the treatment. Advanced electronics and surveillance types multiplied. As the transport planes appeared, they were often pulled back to the factory for refit as one or another of the electronics versions. The appetite of the services for these valuable aircraft was insatiable. Over 220 of the main types alone were built, disregarding the one-offs and the small runs. Most of these planes were also completely re-equipped at least once in their lifetime. Between the Air Force and the Navy, over 25 different designations were used to identify versions of the radar-equipped Connies and their control centre brethren. In addition to proving the concept and paving the way for their successors, these constellations also performed very real service in an era when there was no other practical solution. At the height of the Cold War, when hostility and distrust often combined in equal degree to form policy, a calmer picture of reality was maintained by these electronic eyes in the sky. In 1962, the RC designation was changed to EC, and the electronics Connies were to earn their later Vietnam fame under that designation. They were a pivotal factor in US defensive strategy and had become as important as the cargo-carrying versions were dispensable. Despite using non-standard fuel and requiring piston engine maintenance that was an almost dead art form, the Connies were nursed along. Old age and technological redundancy could not undermine their essential functions, and some were to remain in service until the early 1980s. Their longevity was helped not only by their expert care, but by the excellence of their original design and construction. The jet age was, however, drawing in on the Constellation's career. It was obvious that the introduction of jet airliners would change the whole market expectation, and Lockheed were determined not to be left behind. Aware of the limitations of early jet technology, they set about refining a system of compound engines, or jet props, using jet engines to drive propellers. They'd already extended the piston engine by the use of turbines driven by the exhausts. These had added 20% more power to the engines, and were the peak of piston engine development. Employing a jet and prop combination was designed to extract maximum economical efficiency from both technologies. Once again, the test bed for an aviation milestone was old 1961. In its last major notable achievement, the venerable airframe was fitted with an Allison turboprop in the outboard starboard position. This engine couldn't save the Connie, but it was part of the foundation of one of Lockheed's most successful aircraft, the C-130 Hercules. It was also at the heart of the successful Lockheed Electra, which kept the company alive in the civilian market. However, for the Constellation, its success as the pinnacle of piston engine airliners somehow acted against anyone taking a jet-powered version seriously, even though the finest development, the Starliner, was yet to come. With a new wing shape and other major revisions, the Starliner carried Lockheed's hopes of continued dominance of the long-range airliner market. However, though orders for Super Connies didn't dry up immediately, there was no flood of orders for the new plane. Only 44 of this vastly improved version were built, and most were phased out of service relatively quickly, being replaced by jets. The improvements made to the Starliner were numerous, and it was undoubtedly the finest piston-engined airliner of all time. But it was too late. Lockheed's enterprise, imagination, and innovation continued to work around the Constellation, and several refinements, including the now familiar revolving antenna, were developed and tested with Connies. The new development of the Starliner gave Lockheed a new proposal to put to the Air Force, and the company invested considerable time and money sorting out the best package it could develop around the plane. The revolving dish was only one of the systems developed for the submission. With turboprops, extended range, specialized layouts, and a large number of new features and improvements, the Starliner was being prepared for what would be the next sales opportunity. By then, the success of the airborne radar and control planes demanded that a fleet of such aircraft be maintained. The aging C-121s would need replacement. By the time the competition was announced, Lockheed knew that no matter how excellent their proposal was, they didn't really stand a chance. Hard on the heels of the formal call for tenders came the specifications, and these confirmed Lockheed's fears. Time had stolen a march on the military Starliner, as well as the civilian version. The Air Force was not just in the market for a replacement for their Constellations. To be more precise, they were in the market for a jet-powered plane. The Boeing company had the world's best such aircraft on its catalogue, developed for the Air Force as a jet tanker, the KC-135. The result was a foregone conclusion. However, the appearance of their replacement did not signal the end of the Connie's military career. Whereas the arrival of Boeing's jet had seen the quick demise of civilian constellations, the Air Force and Navy were content with the capabilities of the plane, and coincidentally, they had need of them. The first USAF C-121s to be based in the Asian theatre arrived in Thailand in April 1965, although Navy planes had been the first Connies involved, starting with missions in August 1964 at the time of the Gulf of Tonkin incident. The Constellations flew throughout the war, and their service was invaluable. They performed in a number of functions, some of which were developed and tested as a response to the armed combat raging below and in the air around them. The big plane's commodious fuselages saw many refits. The variety of Constellations deployed to Vietnam illustrates the way the big planes had taken on so many roles for the services. Their main work was as airborne early warning aircraft, but they were also used for a number of other missions. A few cargo versions were used, primarily for aeromedical evacuation and as passenger planes. However, beyond that, the specialist electronics planes filled a number of roles. One of these was the relay of data from sensors scattered along the North Vietnamese supply routes as part of Operation Igloo White. To have diverted the jets to these tasks when they were needed as refueling tankers would have been highly impractical, and the Connies, available and reliable, soldiered on. The Constellation's original deployment to Vietnam was essentially defensive. They were to be used to provide a radar picket to guard against North Vietnamese bombers attacking targets in the south. However, this proved to be a short-lived need, and the duties that kept them in the theatre were over a broad spectrum. One of the most unusual roles the Connie was called on to perform fell to this plane, an NC-121J of the Navy's Development Squadron VX-8. The designation was given to a group of planes that were variously modified to secret specifications. There was no conformity within the designation. It was, effectively, a grab bag for various one-off Connie versions. This plane, for example, had its own special fit and its own special mission. The equipment fitted to this plane was definitely non-standard in military terms. These 2-inch tape players were the ultimate in professional television formats at the time. The duty of the aircraft was to serve as a television and radio broadcaster for the armed services networks. By hauling the transmission aloft, the service was taken out of range of Viet Cong interference. Ground-based transmission would have required infrastructure which, as a tempting target, would have needed constant guard. The quietly plodding Constellation transmitting from on high made the maintenance of service broadcasts practical. Of course, most of the Constellation activity in Vietnam was far more actively involved in the conflict, with the most important work being performed in monitoring the North Vietnamese. As soon as operations over the north began, the Constellations became essential factors in the struggle. As the war went on, their role gradually evolved from passive to active involvement. Operating over their own ground, the North Vietnamese MiGs were given very accurate information about the whereabouts of US aircraft in their airspace. This advantage was at first simply countered by the operations of the US radar planes, which were able to relay similar information about MiG activity to the American strike aircraft. As the war went on, the Connies increasingly assumed a more active role, making direct contact with American fighters and guiding them in attack on any North Vietnamese activity. When the North became better equipped with missiles, the Connies were able to fix the location of any SAM site radars that were operating. This served two purposes. It warned aircraft in the area to expect trouble, and it led the Iron Hand Weasels to attack the sites. The last Constellation operations in the theatre were flown in May 1974. Well after the last operational strikes by US forces, the big observers continued their monitoring. By then, it was 25 years after the first electronics refitted Connie had so impressed the Navy. It was also 31 years after the first Constellation flight.